"You missed your chance, old man." The words cracked across the salt-thick air just as the steel hatch began to seal. Lieutenant Bryce Coleman stood at the foot of the gangway with one gloved hand raised, his posture rigid with the kind of authority that had not yet been tested. Behind him, the black hull of the USS Ardent loomed against the gray Atlantic swells, 150 feet of silent power tethered to the pier like some sleeping predator. Sailors moved with clipped precision under floodlights, their boots ringing on steel, their voices swallowed by wind coming hard off the harbor. And before all of them stood Thomas Whitaker, 84 years old, white-haired, shoulders slightly bent by time but not by weakness, his weathered hand resting on a worn leather satchel darkened by decades of salt and sun. He did not step back. He did not argue. He simply looked beyond Coleman, past the officers, toward the submarine as though seeing something no one else could. Coleman gave a humorless smile. "This is a classified readiness exercise. Civilians don't board nuclear boats because they feel nostalgic." A few younger sailors exchanged quiet smirks. To them, he was just another old veteran wandering too close to a place built for younger men. Thomas's face remained still, almost carved from old driftwood, but his pale eyes held a strange steadiness that unsettled even those mocking him. He spoke at last, his voice low and rough like gravel under tires. "Tell Admiral Calloway the man from depth 900 is here." For a second, even the wind seemed to pause. Then Coleman laughed. It was sharp, dismissive, almost theatrical. "Depth 900? What is that supposed to be? Some old sailor ghost story?" He turned to the security petty officer beside him. "Escort him off the pier." The petty officer hesitated, just for a breath. Something about the old man's tone had carried weight. But Coleman had already stepped closer, lowering his voice. "Sir, whatever stories you tell at veterans' halls may impress people inland. Out here we deal in orders." Thomas said nothing. The silence around him was not empty. It was heavy. A tug horn moaned somewhere out in the channel. A gull wheeled overhead. The Ardent's ballast vents hissed softly, preparing for departure. Then Coleman made the mistake. His eyes dropped to the leather satchel. "What's in the museum bag?" he said, reaching toward it with a mocking grin. As his hand brushed the worn strap, the satchel slipped, struck the concrete, and spilled open. Something metallic clinked and rolled across the pier, stopping in a pool of sodium light. Petty Officer Daniel Hayes bent and picked it up. It was a pressure gauge face, old and scarred, one cracked needle frozen over faded numbers. Not a souvenir. Something torn from machinery that had once lived under impossible pressure. Hayes stared. His pulse shifted. Thomas looked at him, and for the first time there was something like warning in his gaze. "Careful with that," he said softly. "It once kept a boat alive." Coleman scoffed, but his voice had lost some certainty. "This exercise sails in 4 minutes." He motioned toward the gangway. "Move him." But Hayes was still looking at the gauge, at the corrosion around the rim, at the faded stencil etched near the edge, Mariner 7. Something old and half-forgotten stirred in the back of his mind. A briefing once. A classified incident spoken of in whispers. Depth 900. He looked from the metal in his hand to the old man beside the gangway, and for the first time, he had the cold sense that everyone on this pier might be standing inside a mistake. Petty Officer Hayes did not hand the pressure gauge back right away. His thumb traced the corroded rim while the Atlantic wind tugged at his cover, and in that brief silence the sounds of the pier sharpened unnaturally, the metallic groan of mooring lines, the faint hum from the submarine's auxiliary systems, the restless slap of dark water against pilings. Lieutenant Coleman noticed the hesitation and frowned. "Hayes, that belongs in a junk bin. Move the old man." But Hayes barely heard him. Mariner 7. The name pressed against an old memory like a shape beneath ice. He had heard it once during Advanced Systems briefing at Groton, spoken only after the room had been cleared and the instructor lowered his voice. A submarine trapped. Below crush depth. A classified survival anomaly. An unnamed enlisted man who brought a boat home when physics said it should have been lost. Hayes lifted his eyes to Thomas Whitaker. The old veteran had not moved. He stood with his hands at his sides as if the whole harbor revolved too slowly to concern him. "Sir," Hayes said carefully, "where did you get this?" Coleman snapped before Thomas could answer. "Enough. This pier is not a history museum." He reached for the gauge, but Hayes instinctively drew it back. It was a small movement, almost invisible, but it changed the air between them. Coleman saw it too. His jaw tightened. "Petty officer, that is an order." Hayes swallowed. "Permission to verify something first, sir." The lieutenant gave a cold laugh. "Verify what, a fairy tale?" Thomas's gaze shifted toward the submarine's sail rising black against the floodlights. "She should not dive without a full trim check on forward ballast too," he said quietly. Coleman turned. "Excuse me?" Thomas nodded toward the hull. "Listen." At first it seemed absurd. Then even Hayes heard it. A faint, irregular pulse buried beneath the mechanical hum. A muted vibration almost too subtle to register. Coleman stiffened but covered it with contempt. "You think you can diagnose a nuclear submarine from a pier by ear?" Thomas did not answer. The old man's silence somehow carried more conviction than argument. A gust swept across the dock, rattling loose chain against bollards. Somewhere above, signal lights blinked over the harbor mouth. Hayes felt unease tighten in his chest. He stepped aside, drew out his secure handheld, and with fingers suddenly colder than the wind, entered a restricted incident query. "Depth 900. The screen flashed denial, then prompted command clearance. He entered a secondary route tied to old naval incident archives. A red banner appeared. "Restricted survivor list classified by Fleet Command." Hayes stared. Beneath it, one partial record surfaced before the file locked again. "Thomas Whitaker. Status. Sealed honors directive." Hayes's mouth went dry. Coleman saw his face change. "What did you do?" he demanded. Hayes did not answer at first. He looked at Thomas as though seeing him for the first time. Not as an old civilian at the gate, but as a man carrying something immense and deliberately hidden. The lieutenant stepped forward, anger beginning to fray into uncertainty. "Petty officer." Hayes finally spoke, voice low. "Sir, I think we need to notify Fleet Command." Coleman stared as if struck by the suggestion. "Over this." Hayes held up the cracked gauge under the floodlight. "No, sir. Over who is standing on this pier." For a long second, no one moved. Then from somewhere deep inside the submarine came a low warning tone, brief but unmistakable. Thomas Whitaker lifted his eyes toward the black water beyond the breakwater and said in that same quiet gravel voice, "She remembers." And for reasons he could not explain, every hair on Hayes's arms rose. Lieutenant Coleman opened his mouth to speak, but the words never came. The warning tone from inside the submarine had faded, yet its echo seemed to linger over the pier like a pressure front before a storm. Sailors who moments earlier had been moving with routine efficiency now glanced toward the hull with quiet uncertainty. Even the laughter was gone. Hayes looked down at his handheld again, thumb hovering over a secure command relay channel that junior petty officers did not use unless something had gone badly wrong. His training told him to defer to rank. Something older and deeper told him rank was no longer the highest authority present. Coleman stepped close enough that Hayes could smell cold salt on his jacket. "Put that device away," he said, voice low with controlled irritation. "You are making a career mistake." Hayes looked up. "With respect, sir, I think one has already been made." The words landed heavier than he intended. Coleman's face hardened, but before he could answer, Thomas Whitaker bent slowly and retrieved his leather satchel. His movements were deliberate, almost ceremonial, and in the harsh dock lights the old scars on his hands showed white against weathered skin. He slipped the cracked gauge back inside as if returning a relic to its proper chamber. Then he looked at the submarine and for a fleeting second his pale eyes seemed somewhere else entirely. The wind shifted, carrying diesel memory and ocean cold, and the harbor dissolved in his mind. Steel walls closed in. Red emergency lights washed a narrow control room in dim glow. Depth gauges trembling. Condensation beating on pipes. He was 23 again aboard the Mariner 7. listening as the hull groaned under pressure no boat should survive. A young lieutenant beside him, Richard Calloway, trying to hide fear under command tone. Men watching one another in silence because no one wanted to be the first to speak what they all knew. They were too deep. Then Thomas, younger hands moving over failing valves, hearing not machinery but rhythm, the breathing of a wounded vessel. Shift trim manually, he had said back then, ignoring doctrine. Trust the boat. The memory flashed and vanished. He was back on the pier before the black hull of the Ardent. Coleman had been speaking but stopped when he saw something in the old man's expression he did not understand. Hayes pressed the secure channel. The line crackled once before a clipped voice answered from Fleet Command. Command watch. Hayes swallowed. Petty Officer Daniel Hayes, USS Ardent Pier Detail. I request immediate authentication on sealed honors directive linked to Thomas Whitaker. Silence. Then keyboard clicks. Coleman took a half step toward him, incredulous. You actually made the call. Hayes ignored him. The wind scraped flags against their poles overhead. At last the voice returned, but now different, sharper. Repeat the name. Hayes did. Another pause. Then, unexpectedly, the voice lowered. Stand by. Do not let that individual leave. Coleman froze. Those words were not meant for pranksters or confused old men. They carried the weight of protocols few ever heard spoken aloud. Hayes felt his heartbeat in his throat. Seconds stretched. Then a second voice came on the line, older, harder, carrying command without effort. Who has Thomas Whitaker waiting at a pier? Every sailor within earshot looked up. Even Coleman seemed unable to breathe. Hayes answered almost in a whisper. Lieutenant Bryce Coleman, sir. There was a silence so complete the harbor itself seemed listening. Then the voice said one sentence. Patch me through to Admiral Calloway now. Coleman's confidence, so crisp an hour before, seemed to loosen like badly tied rope. He turned slowly toward Thomas, as though seeing not an intruder but a question history had just placed in front of him. Thomas only looked at the black water beyond the submarine pens and murmured, almost to himself, Richard still hates being kept waiting. The reply did not come through the handset first. It came through the loudspeaker over the pier. A burst of static cracked across the harbor. Then a voice filled the salt air with such authority that conversations died mid-breath. This is Admiral Richard Calloway. Who is holding Thomas Whitaker at my dock? The words were not shouted. They did not need to be. They carried the quiet force of command long practiced and never questioned. Every sailor on the pier turned toward the nearest speaker as though the metal itself had begun speaking. Lieutenant Coleman's face drained of color. Hayes lowered the handheld slowly, almost reverently. Even the wind seemed to recede. Coleman stepped forward, trying to recover the structure of protocol that had been slipping from his grasp since the first secure call. Admiral, sir. Lieutenant Bryce Coleman. Standard boarding restrictions were in effect. I was not aware. The voice cut him off. No, Lieutenant. You were not. There was no anger in it, which somehow made it heavier. Thomas Whitaker stood motionless, hands resting on the old leather satchel. His expression unreadable except for the faintest trace of something almost like amusement. Then Calloway spoke again, but now the voice had changed. It lost command steel and took on something older. Personal. Tom, is that you? For the first time, the old veteran looked up toward the speaker mast and answered, almost as if greeting a friend over coffee instead of across a naval base. You are late, Richard. A few stunned sailors exchanged glances. Hayes felt the moment pass through the pier like current. Coleman simply stared. No one addressed admirals that way. No one except perhaps those who had known them before stars covered their shoulders. A low chuckle came through the speaker, warm and astonishingly human. Still keeping score, I see. Then the humor vanished and command returned. Ardent control. Belay dive sequence immediately. A sharp acknowledgement answered over internal comms. Crewmen near the gangway moved instinctively, uncertainty replaced by disciplined urgency. The submarine's warning indicators shifted. Ballast preparation halted. Somewhere deep inside the vessel machinery changed pitch. Thomas tilted his head slightly, listening, as if hearing an old song resumed. Coleman found his voice. Sir, with respect, should we bring Mr. Whitaker aboard by launch? The reply came like iron set down on oak. Negative. A pause. Then words no one on the pier would forget. Surface the Ardent. For a heartbeat, even experienced sailors looked confused. The submarine was already moored, visible, present. Then realization spread. The order was ceremonial, not operational. Full ballast reset. Full emergence posture. Bring her up as if rising from patrol, because a man of consequence was boarding. It was honor rendered through steel and seawater. Hayes felt his throat tighten. Coleman looked as though he had stepped into a story too large to survive intact. Thomas only gazed at the dark hull, and another memory moved behind his eyes. A younger Richard Calloway climbing from a flooded control compartment decades earlier, salt on his face, saying through exhaustion, "If we live through this, I owe you every sunrise I get." Back on the pier, floodlights glowed against black water as pumps began cycling. The harbor surface trembled in widening rings. Crew members who minutes before had mocked an old man now stood at attention without being ordered. Hayes noticed Coleman slowly remove his cover, not from regulation but instinct. Then Admiral Calloway's voice returned one last time over the loudspeaker, softer now, almost carrying through years instead of air. "No one makes Thomas Whitaker ask twice to board one of my boats." And in the silence that followed, even Lieutenant Bryce Coleman understood something had surfaced that night far older than the submarine before them. The water around. The Ardent began to churn with slow, deliberate force, not the hurried agitation of routine mechanics but something almost ceremonial, as ballast systems cycled in a pattern few junior sailors had ever witnessed outside training films. Floodlights struck the rippling harbor in fractured silver. Steam drifted in thin ghosts above venting lines. Every sound sharpened, chain against steel, valves breathing, the low hydraulic pulse of a vessel answering an old command. Petty Officer Hayes stood motionless, feeling as if the pier itself had become part of some ritual older than regulation. Lieutenant Coleman no longer looked like the confident gatekeeper from an hour before. He stood with his cap in his hand, shoulders still squared but emptied of arrogance, watching Thomas Whitaker as if searching for a way to reconcile the quiet old man with the command that had just altered the movement of a nuclear submarine. Thomas stepped closer to the water's edge, hands folded behind his back, and his weathered face softened in the flood glow. "She still trims heavy at the bow," he murmured. Hayes heard it and almost smiled, because he realized the old man was not speaking metaphorically. He was speaking as if the submarine were a living thing he had known for years. Coleman glanced over. "You can tell that from here?" Thomas gave the faintest nod. "Steel talks, Lieutenant. You only have to listen long enough." The words settled into Coleman harder than any rebuke could have. Then the forward hatch on the Ardent rotated open with a metallic groan, and a row of sailors emerged along the casing, taking positions in crisp silence. No shouted orders, no scrambling, just practiced movement touched now by something solemn. At the center of them, framed in white deck lights, a senior commander stepped to the rail and raised a hand in salute toward the pier. The gesture was for one man only. Hayes felt a chill despite the damp Atlantic air. A launch boat was moving out from the dock, but before anyone could speak, Thomas's eyes drifted again, and memory pulled him backward. He was young aboard Mariner 7, seawater dripping from overhead piping, a frightened ensign named Richard Calloway, gripping a chart table while depth alarms pulsed. "If we lose power?" the young officer had asked. Thomas, grease on his hands and calm where panic should have lived, had answered, "Then we rise by nerve instead of machinery." The memory dissolved with the hiss of ballast venting. Back on the pier, Coleman spoke quietly, almost to himself. "I nearly had security remove him," Hayes answered without judgment. "So did history, maybe?" The lieutenant looked at him, then slowly stepped toward Thomas. For a long moment he seemed to struggle against pride, then offered a stiff but genuine apology. "Sir, I misjudged you." Thomas turned, pale eyes clear under the lights. That happens more often than submarines surfacing for old mechanics. To Coleman's surprise, there was humor there. Gentle, not cutting. It disarmed him more completely than anger would have. Then a new sound rolled across the harbor, rotor wash. Heads lifted. A dark military helicopter approached low over the channel. Navigation lights blinking red and green through mist. Hayes's breath caught. No one had mentioned an arrival. Yet as the aircraft banked toward the command pier, Thomas merely watched with quiet familiarity. Richard always preferred dramatic entrances, he said. The helicopter descended toward the adjacent pad, wash flattening flags and scattering spray in silver sheets. Sailors instinctively snapped straighter. Coleman did too. And as the wheels touched down and the cabin door began to open, every man on the pier understood the night was no longer about correcting a mistake. It was about witnessing a debt being repaid. The helicopter door opened before the rotors had fully slowed. A tall figure stepped down into whipping spray and floodlight haze, dress coat snapping in the wind, for stars bright even through the mist. Admiral Richard Calloway did not pause for protocol. He moved with the blunt certainty of a man crossing toward unfinished business. Sailors along the pier came rigid at attention almost by instinct, boots fixed, eyes forward, though many could not keep from glancing toward Thomas Whitaker. Lieutenant Coleman swallowed hard as the Admiral approached, each footfall ringing against the wet concrete. Petty Officer Hayes felt his pulse beating in his neck. He had seen admirals before at inspections, distant figures wrapped in ceremony. This was different. This felt personal. Calloway stopped not before the submarine, not before the assembled officers, but directly in front of Thomas. For one impossible second, no one moved. Two old men stood facing one another beneath spinning rotor wash, floodlights reflecting in black water beside a surfaced warship. Then the Admiral raised his hand in a slow, precise salute. It was not casual acknowledgement. It was full military honor. Several sailors drew breath sharply. Lieutenant Coleman looked almost unsteady. Thomas Whitaker studied the Admiral's face, older now, lined by decades of command, but still carrying traces of the frightened young lieutenant from a steel coffin beneath the Atlantic. Then Thomas returned the salute. His hand trembled only with age, never with uncertainty. When the salutes lowered, Calloway smiled, a rare expression that seemed to erase rank for a moment. "You still look like trouble, Tom," Thomas answered without missing a beat. "And you still need someone to keep your boats alive." A few nearby sailors exchanged stunned glances at the ease between them. Then the Admiral did something no one expected. He stepped forward and clasped Thomas by both shoulders, not as superior to subordinate, but as brother to brother. The gesture carried more weight than speeches. Coleman lowered his eyes. Hayes understood he was watching living history step out of classified silence. Calloway turned then, his expression shifting back toward command. "Lieutenant Coleman." The younger officer stepped forward so fast his heels struck hard against the pier. "Sir, do you know who you denied boarding tonight?" Coleman hesitated. "No, Admiral." Calloway nodded once. "Few do." His gaze drifted to the dark hull of the Ardent. 47 years ago, a submarine should have been lost at 900 feet. It came home because a chief machinist ignored doctrine and trusted steel over panic. He looked back at Thomas. "I was the junior officer who learned the difference." Silence settled so deep even the harbor seemed listening. Hayes felt the words enter every man present. Some stories did not need embellishment. Their restraint made them larger. Coleman's voice came low. "Sir, I nearly had him removed." Calloway studied him, not harshly. "Then tonight you learned rank is not the only thing worth recognizing." Thomas glanced toward the Ardent, where sailors still stood in silent formation. "Is she ready?" he asked. The Admiral's eyes warmed. "Only if you inspect her first." A murmur almost rose among the crew before discipline caught it. Thomas Whitaker, the old man stopped at the gate, was being asked by an admiral to inspect a nuclear submarine. Yet somehow it felt not extraordinary but overdue. As launch crew prepared the boarding boat, Hayes noticed something change among the sailors. They no longer looked at Thomas with curiosity. They looked with reverence. The Admiral gestured toward the water. "Come aboard, Chief." Thomas paused before stepping toward the launch. He looked once at Coleman and said quietly, "Never mistake worn hands for empty ones." The lieutenant nodded as though receiving instruction no academy had offered. And as the boat eased from the pier toward the waiting submarine, rotor wash fading into ocean wind, Hayes realized the true surfacing that night was not the Ardent. It was memory itself, rising where no one expected. The launch boat cut through Black Harbor water in a narrow silver wake, its engine humming low beneath the broader breathing of the sea. Thomas Whitaker stood rather than sat, one hand resting lightly on the rail despite the rocking, coat moving in the cold Atlantic wind. Admiral Calloway stood beside him in silence, as though words between them had long ago become optional. Behind them, Lieutenant Coleman and Petty Officer Hayes watched from the pier until distance softened them into figures beneath floodlights. Ahead, the Ardent rose dark and immense, its hull glistening with spray. Sailors lined along the casing like carved silhouettes. As the launch came alongside, a rope ladder dropped, though before crew could assist, Thomas reached for the rail and climbed with a measured steadiness that made younger men unconsciously step aside. Boots touched steel. For a moment no one moved. Then the commander who had saluted from the casing stepped forward. "Welcome aboard, Chief Whitaker. Not Mr. Not civilian. Chief." The old title carried like a bell. Thomas gave a small nod and let his palm rest briefly on the submarine's skin. "Still warm," he murmured. "Good sign." The commander exchanged a puzzled look with a junior officer, but Admiral Calloway only smiled faintly. They descended through the open hatch into the control room, where red instrument glow painted faces in muted amber and green. Air smelled of machinery, metal, and coffee held too long on a warmer. Young officers stood straighter as Thomas passed, some curious, some reverent without fully knowing why. He moved slowly through the compartment, fingertips grazing a valve housing, pausing at a ballast control manifold. "Who calibrated forward trim too?" he asked. An ensign blinked in surprise. "I did, sir." Thomas tilted his head. "Port response lagging 3/10." The ensign frowned, checked a console, then stared as readings confirmed it. Even the Admiral raised an eyebrow, though perhaps not from surprise, but recognition. Thomas moved on. At the sonar station he listened a moment to a faint rhythmic pulse through a headset and nodded. "Bearing drift corrected. Good." Sailors began exchanging glances that no longer held skepticism but wonder. It was not theatrics. The old man was reading the boat the way musicians read old instruments. Then he stopped before a brass plate mounted discreetly beside a bulkhead. His expression changed. Hayes, who had been unexpectedly invited aboard by Calloway, stepped closer and read the engraving. "In honor of the Depth 900 Survival Directive." Thomas said nothing. His hand touched the plaque once, almost absently, and memory overtook him again. Steel groaning, emergency lamps dim, a young Richard Calloway shouting depth numbers over rising fear. Thomas wrenching a frozen trim bypass with bleeding knuckles, then laughing when pressure eased because laughter was the only answer left. Back in the present, Calloway stood beside him and said quietly, "I had that installed when I took command. But I never thought you would see it." Thomas answered without looking up. "I never thought you would keep your promise." The Admiral's voice dropped almost to a whisper. "I owed you a boat." Silence gathered, heavy and respectful. Even the youngest sailors seemed to feel they were inside something sacred. Then Thomas turned toward the helm. "Take us out 10 yards and bring her back on station." The commander hesitated, glancing at Calloway. The Admiral nodded. Orders were given. The submarine moved with a barely felt shift. Thomas watched instruments as if greeting old companions. When the maneuver ended, he looked at the commander. "She is ready." Relief passed visibly through the crew. It was absurd and yet unmistakable that everyone had wanted his approval. As they prepared to surface fully back to ceremonial station, Hayes realized the story had grown beyond humiliation reversed. It had become something rarer. a hidden standard by which men measured themselves. And as Thomas Whitaker stood in the dim control room surrounded by sailors half his age hanging on every quiet word, it seemed possible some legends do not fade. They simply wait below the surface until called back. When the maneuver ended and the Ardent settled back into ceremonial station, something subtle had changed inside the control room. The young officers no longer watched Thomas Whitaker as a curiosity invited aboard by privilege. They watched him the way apprentices study a master whose craft had nearly vanished. Even the air felt different, less mechanical, almost charged by memory. Admiral Calloway seemed to sense it too. He turned toward the crew and, with none of the stiffness of formal address, said, "There is one compartment he has not seen." The commander understood immediately. A narrow passage opened toward the wardroom, and the small procession moved through steel corridors lit in muted amber. Pipes ran overhead. Deck plates carried the faint vibration of latent power. Thomas walked slowly, fingertips brushing bulkheads as though reacquainting himself with old habits of steel and motion. Hayes followed close enough to hear him murmur once, almost to himself, "She smells right." They entered the wardroom, where a long polished table sat beneath framed patrol photos and faded service pennants. But at the far wall stood something no one had mentioned. In a shadow box of dark walnut rested an old brass wrench, short-handled, scarred, one edge custom ground by hand. Beside it sat a cracked analog depth dial, its needle frozen near impossible numbers. Thomas stopped as if struck by time itself. His breathing changed. The room held still. "You kept the wrench," he said. Calloway nodded. "You left it in my hands the night we surfaced." Thomas stepped closer, old fingers hovering just shy of the glass. Hayes saw emotion pass across his face not as weakness but as gravity. "I thought the sea had taken it." The Admiral gave a faint smile. The sea returned enough. No one spoke for several seconds. Even the youngest sailors seemed to understand they were standing before relics not of hardware but of loyalty. Then Calloway did something unexpected. He reached beneath the display, withdrew a velvet case, and opened it. Inside rested a worn silver dolphin's insignia unlike modern issue, older, simpler, edges softened by years. Thomas looked at it in silence. "Chief Whitaker," the Admiral said, and now his voice carried ceremony after all. "By authority long delayed and gratitude never exhausted, these are returned to the man who earned them below 900 feet. The room seemed to hold its breath. Thomas did not immediately take the insignia. Instead his eyes moved over the faces around him, sailors, officers, Hayes, even the commander standing rigid near the hatch. Then he accepted it with hands that had once steadied a submarine under crushing dark. A junior ensign near the back whispered, almost involuntarily, "Sir," but could not finish. Thomas pinned the dolphins to his old coat with slow care. The metal looked small against worn cloth, yet somehow brighter than rank. Then Calloway gestured toward a framed photograph beside the display. Hayes leaned in. 5 young submariners in black and white stood grinning on a pier long gone. One of them unmistakably a young Thomas, another a lean Richard Calloway. Before command hardened his face. Under the image was engraved a single line. "Some boats surface because men refuse to sink." Thomas read it and gave the faintest laugh. "You were always dramatic." "I learned from a machinist," Calloway answered. The room eased into quiet smiles, but the deepest shift came in Lieutenant Coleman, who had been escorted aboard late and now stood near the hatch, humbled nearly beyond speech. He stepped forward, looked at the old photograph, then at Thomas. "Sir, may I ask something?" Thomas nodded. Coleman swallowed. "Why did you come tonight?" The old veteran considered, then answered with the simplicity of truth. "To make sure she still remembered what matters." Those words settled deeper than doctrine. As the crew stood around relics of steel and friendship, Hayes understood the climax had never been the Admiral's order or the surface submarine. It was this transfer of memory, old honor quietly placed into younger hands before it vanished. And somewhere in the submarine's low living hum, it felt as though the vessel itself approved. For a long while no one in the wardroom moved. The old silver dolphins rested on Thomas Whitaker's coat, catching warm light with each slow breath, while the hum of the submarine wrapped around the room like a living memory. It was Admiral Calloway who finally broke the silence. "There is one more thing," he said. He nodded toward the commander, who stepped to a cabinet and brought out a visitor log bound in dark leather, its pages reserved for heads of state, fleet commanders, and names carried into the Navy's permanent memory. He laid it open before Thomas. The old veteran studied the blank line offered to him and gave a faint smile. "I was never much for signing things," Calloway answered softly. "Tonight is not for paperwork. It is for history." Thomas took the pen. His hand moved slowly but steady, writing Thomas Whitaker, Chief Machinist, Mariner 7. Then beneath it, after a pause, he added a second line. "Trust the boat." Several young officers leaned forward as though watching a sacred text completed. Lieutenant Coleman stood nearest, no trace of the old arrogance left in him. He looked at the words as if committing them to memory. Soon after, the launch prepared to return to shore. No one wished to hurry the moment, yet all understood endings carried their own dignity. On the casing under cold stars, the crew had assembled again in silent ranks. As Thomas climbed back toward the launch, sailors stood at attention without command. One by one hands rose in salute, not choreographed, not ordered, simply offered. Thomas paused halfway down the ladder and looked back over the dark curve of the Ardent, the young faces, the Admiral at the hatch. "Take care of her," he said. The commander answered, "Aye, Chief." It was spoken with the gravity of an oath. The ride back across the harbor was quieter than the first. The sea had flattened, moonlight silvering the wake. Hayes sat near the bow, saying little, sensing words would only diminish what he had witnessed. Coleman finally spoke, voice almost lost in the engine hum. "Sir, may I ask one last thing?" Thomas looked over. "Go ahead, Lieutenant." Coleman hesitated. "How do you know when someone deserves respect before their story is known?" Thomas watched the black water sliding past. "You start by offering it before they have to prove they earned it." No one answered after that. The launch touched the pier. Admiral Calloway stepped out with Thomas and walked him all the way to the gate where the night had begun. The same gate, the same floodlights, yet nothing felt the same. Before Thomas left, Calloway reached into his coat pocket and pressed something into his hand. It was the cracked pressure gauge face from the old satchel, now polished at the rim. "You forgot this," the Admiral said. Thomas turned it over, smiled, and slipped it back into the worn leather bag. "No," he said. "I think I came to make sure you had not." They stood for a moment as old friends who had outlived explanations. Then Thomas Whitaker walked alone toward the parking lot, small against the sweep of harbor lights, coat moving in the wind, and disappeared into the dark as quietly as he had arrived. No escort, no ceremony, just a man returning to ordinary life after extraordinary remembrance. Hayes remained by the gate long after, watching the empty road. Years later he would tell new sailors about that night, not as legend but as instruction. About a submarine surfaced for one old mechanic. About an admiral who saluted before he spoke. About a lieutenant who learned humility at a pier. And above all about the truth hidden beneath uniforms and age. Because some men do not ask the world to remember them. They simply live in such a way that memory rises on its own. And as the Ardent's lights glowed across the harbor, Petty Officer Hayes understood something he would carry the rest of his life. Respect is not demanded. It is recognized, often too late but never without power. Some salutes last a lifetime,